The sound of shattering glass echoed through the upscale restaurant as Minjun's fist connected with the wine bottle on the table. His dark eyes burned with a fury that made every patron within 20 feet step back in alarm. Across from him, Zara froze with her hand still resting on Marcus's arm, her warm brown skin suddenly pale with terror. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Minjun's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. His Korean accent thickened with rage as he towered over their intimate table for two. 3 years of marriage, and this is how you repay me." Marcus immediately stood, his athletic frame positioning protectively in front of Zara. "Sir, I think you need to calm down. This isn't what it looks like." Minjun's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Not what it looks like. My wife having dinner with another man, touching him like she's never touched me, smiling at him the way she used to smile at me before our wedding day destroyed everything." The restaurant manager approached cautiously, but one look at Minjun's face sent him retreating to call security. Zara finally found her voice, though it trembled with a mixture of fear and defiance she'd been suppressing for months. "Minjun, please. You're making a scene. People are staring and recording with their phones. This will be all over social media within an hour." "Let them stare," he spat, his perfectly styled hair falling across his forehead as he leaned closer. "Let them see what happens when a wife decides her husband isn't enough anymore. When she finds herself a replacement who actually talks to her, actually listens." The pain beneath his anger was so raw that even Marcus stepped back, recognizing something deeper than simple jealousy. Zara's heart clenched as she saw the man she'd married struggling beneath the surface of his rage. Before we go any further into this moment that changed everything between them, I'm curious about all of you watching from around the world. Whether you're tuned in from New York, London, Seoul, or anywhere else, have you ever felt that crushing distance in a relationship where love exists but connection feels impossible? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and if you've experienced that painful gap between loving someone and actually feeling loved by them. 6 months earlier, their marriage had been a different kind of broken. Not the explosive, public devastation of this restaurant confrontation, but the slow, suffocating death of intimacy that happens when two people love each other but cannot bridge the space between their hearts. Zara remembered the exact moment she'd started building walls around her feelings. It was their 6-month anniversary, and Minjun had returned from a business trip with expensive earrings and an apology for missing dinner. She'd prepared his favorite meal, worn the silk dress he'd bought her in Paris, and waited 3 hours for him to come home. When he finally arrived, exhausted and distracted, he'd handed her the jewelry box without even looking at her face. The earrings were beautiful and clearly expensive, but they felt like payment rather than affection. She'd thanked him politely, the same way she might thank a store clerk, and he'd nodded before disappearing into his home office to handle urgent emails. That night, lying in their king-sized bed with 2 feet of untouched space between them, Zara had realized that being married to Minjun was the loneliest experience of her life. He provided for her, protected her, and treated her with respectful distance, but he never actually touched her soul. The irony was devastating. Before their marriage, during their brief courtship, he'd been different. Intense and passionate, showing up at her apartment with flowers and staying up all night talking about their dreams. She'd fallen in love with glimpses of vulnerability he'd shared during those stolen moments between his demanding schedule. But the wedding had changed everything. The moment they'd signed those papers and moved into his pristine penthouse, he'd transformed into a polite stranger who shared her bed, but never her heart. His mother's expectations, his father's cold approval, and the weight of taking over the family business had crushed whatever softness he'd once shown her. The distance had grown slowly, like ice forming over a lake. First, he'd stopped reaching for her hand during movies. Then he'd started working later, coming to bed after she was asleep. Their conversations became logistics rather than connection. When did you schedule the cleaning service? Did you remember to pick up my suits? Will you be attending the charity gala with me next week? Physical intimacy became scheduled and mechanical. Once a week, usually Saturday nights, he would turn to her in bed with the same focused efficiency he brought to business meetings. He would touch her body with skill but without passion, bring her to climax with technical precision, then hold her briefly before rolling away to sleep. She felt like a beloved possession being maintained rather than a woman being desired. It wasn't that he was cruel or unkind. Minjun never raised his voice, never criticized her appearance, never made her feel unwanted in the obvious ways. He was the perfect husband on paper, generous with money, protective of her reputation, attentive to her comfort. But he was absent in every way that actually mattered to her heart. Zara had tried everything. Romantic dinners where she'd pour her heart out only to have him respond with polite agreement before changing the subject to safer topics. Surprise visits to his office that he'd receive with mild appreciation and immediate redirection back to work. New lingerie that he'd notice with an approving nod but no increase in genuine desire. The breaking point had come 4 months ago when she discovered she wasn't pregnant after hoping she might be. She'd realized she was relieved rather than disappointed because bringing a child into their emotional wasteland felt like cruelty. That night, she'd cried herself to sleep while Minjun worked late again, and she'd understood that she was slowly disappearing into the role of the perfect Korean businessman's wife. Marcus had entered her life as a colleague, nothing more. He was the new marketing director at the nonprofit where she volunteered, warm and easygoing with an infectious laugh that made everyone around him feel lighter. Initially, their interactions had been purely professional, brainstorming fundraising events and coordinating community outreach programs. But Marcus had something Minjun seemed to have forgotten how to do. He listened. When Zara spoke about her ideas for the literacy program, Marcus would lean forward with genuine interest, ask thoughtful questions, and remember details from previous conversations. When she mentioned loving old jazz music, he'd share YouTube links to songs he thought she'd enjoy. The friendship had developed naturally over shared lunches and collaborative projects. Marcus never pushed boundaries or made inappropriate advances. He simply treated her like a fascinating person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. After months of feeling invisible in her own marriage, his attention was like sunlight after a long winter. Tonight's dinner had been innocent enough in its inception. They'd been working late on the annual gala planning, and Marcus had suggested grabbing food since they'd missed lunch. Zara had hesitated, knowing Minjun wouldn't approve, but the prospect of an hour of actual conversation had been too tempting to resist. The transformation had begun on their wedding night. Zara remembered lying in the honeymoon suite in Jeju Island, wearing the silk nightgown her new mother-in-law had selected for her, waiting for the passionate man who had courted her so intensely to make love to his wife. Instead, Minjun had approached her with the same careful formality he used in business negotiations. She had expected their first night as husband and wife to be different from their stolen moments during courtship. What she hadn't expected was for it to feel like a transaction. He touched her with technical skill, brought her body to climax with practiced efficiency, then held her briefly before moving to his side of the bed. When she tried to initiate conversation afterward, sharing her happiness and hopes for their future, he had listened politely before mentioning they had an early flight back to Seoul. Even then, she'd assumed it was wedding stress and the pressure of family expectations. Minjun's mother had orchestrated every detail of their ceremony with military precision, turning what should have been their day into a performance for Seoul's business elite. Mrs. Park had strong opinions about everything from Zara's hair to her dress to the way she should bow when greeting Minjun's father. The real problems had started when they'd returned to Seoul and moved into the penthouse that Mrs. Park had decorated for them. Zara's belongings looked foreign and out of place among the stark modern furniture and traditional Korean art. She'd tried to add personal touches, photographs from her childhood in Atlanta and plants that reminded her of her grandmother's garden, but somehow they never seemed to fit. Mrs. Park visited daily during those first few months, ostensibly to help Zara adjust to Korean customs, but actually to monitor and correct her every move. The way Zara prepared Minjun's breakfast was too casual. Her Korean pronunciation needed improvement. She should be attending more social functions with the wives of Minjun's business associates. A proper Korean wife anticipated her husband's needs without being asked. The criticism was delivered with smiles and helpful suggestions, but the message was clear. Zara was an outsider who needed constant guidance to avoid embarrassing the family. Minjun never defended her during these visits, instead nodding along with his mother's suggestions as if Zara wasn't in the room. She tried to discuss it with him one evening after a particularly brutal session where Mrs. Park had rearranged their living room furniture because the current arrangement didn't promote harmony. Minjun had listened to her concerns with the same polite attention he gave to business presentations, then assured her that his mother only wanted to help. "Your mother treats me like I'm a project that needs fixing," Zara had said, her voice cracking with frustration. "I feel like I'm failing some test I didn't know I was taking." Minjun had looked genuinely confused by her distress. She's sharing the wisdom of her experience. "In Korea, mothers-in-law guide daughters-in-law. It's tradition. But I'm not Korean," Zara had replied. "I'm American. I'm black. I have my own culture and traditions that matter to me too." He had paused for a long moment, and she'd seen something flicker in his eyes that might have been understanding. But then his face had closed off again, returning to that careful neutrality that was becoming his default expression around her. "I know this is an adjustment," he'd said finally, "but family harmony is important. My mother will accept you more easily if you show willingness to learn." That conversation had been the beginning of Zara's understanding that Minjun was as trapped by his family's expectations as she was. But instead of bringing them together as allies, it had driven a wedge between them. She'd felt abandoned by the one person who should have been on her side, while he'd felt torn between two worlds he couldn't reconcile. The deeper problem, though, was rooted in Minjun's relationship with his father. Mr. Park was a man who had built a business empire through emotional control and strategic thinking. He treated affection like a weakness and vulnerability like a liability. Minjun had grown up watching his father maintain iron discipline over his emotions, never showing anger, never expressing love, never allowing anyone to see him as anything other than perfectly controlled. As a child, Minjun had learned that emotions were dangerous. The one time he'd seen his father cry was after a business rival had destroyed a major deal, costing the company millions. 80-year-old Minjun had found his father in his study, head in his hands, tears streaming down his face. When Mr. Park had noticed his son watching, the shame and fury in his eyes had been terrifying. "Crying is what weak men do when they fail," his father had said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "Strong men control their emotions instead of letting emotions control them. Never let anyone see you break, Minjun. The moment you show weakness, they will destroy you." That lesson had been reinforced throughout Minjun's childhood and adolescence. When he'd struggled in school, his father's response had been icy disappointment rather than support. When he'd been heartbroken after his first girlfriend had left him for someone else, his father had told him that attachment to women made men vulnerable to manipulation. When he'd expressed interest in studying art instead of business, his father had responded with weeks of cold silence that felt like emotional death. By the time Minjun reached adulthood, he had learned to bury his emotions so deeply that even he couldn't access them. The passionate intensity he'd shown Zara during their courtship had been the exception rather than the rule, a brief period when love had been strong enough to break through decades of conditioning. But marriage had brought the full weight of family expectations crashing down on him again. Being a husband meant being a provider and protector, not a lover and companion. It meant maintaining the family honor and continuing the Park legacy. It meant demonstrating the same emotional control that his father had mastered. Minjun genuinely believed that showing vulnerability to his wife would somehow diminish his ability to care for her. The tragic irony was that Minjun loved Zara desperately. She was everything his controlled world had been missing: spontaneous, expressive, warm, and genuine. But he had no idea how to bridge the gap between loving her and actually connecting with her. Every attempt at emotional intimacy felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory where his father's voice whispered warnings about weakness and failure. He noticed the distance growing between them. He saw the light dimming in her eyes during their conversations. He felt her pulling away from him physically and emotionally. But instead of addressing the problem directly, he tried to fix it through traditional gestures: expensive gifts, luxury vacations, and financial security. He provided for her in every material way while starving her of the emotional connection she actually needed. Meanwhile, Zara had begun volunteering at the literacy nonprofit as a way to fill the empty hours in their perfectly appointed penthouse. She needed something that was entirely hers, separate from Mrs. Park's expectations and Minjun's careful distance. Working with children learning to read had reminded her of who she was beyond the role of Korean businessman's wife. Marcus had been hired as marketing director just as Zara was finding her footing in the organization. He was everything Minjun wasn't: emotionally available, culturally curious, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. Their friendship had developed slowly, built on shared projects and mutual respect rather than passion and intensity. But as their working relationship deepened, Zara had begun to realize how starved she was for authentic connection. Marcus remembered details about her life, asked about her family back in Atlanta, and treated her opinions as valuable rather than charmingly naive. He made her laugh with stories about his own cultural missteps as a black man working in predominantly white nonprofit spaces, and he listened without judgment when she shared her struggles with adapting to Korean expectations. Minjun had noticed the changes in her gradually. She seemed lighter when she returned from her volunteer work. She smiled more often and with genuine warmth rather than polite performance. She talked about her projects with enthusiasm and passion that he hadn't seen since their early dating days. But instead of asking what was making her happy, he'd felt threatened by her newfound confidence. The fear that had been building in Minjun's chest for months was the same terror that had haunted his childhood, the fear of being found insufficient and abandoned. But his father's training prevented him from addressing that fear directly or asking for the reassurance he desperately needed. The first sign that something had shifted came on a Tuesday evening in early spring. Minjun arrived home from a particularly brutal day of merger negotiations to find Zara humming in their kitchen, her movements light and graceful as she prepared dinner. She was wearing a sundress he'd never seen before, something bright and flowing that made her dark skin glow under the warm lights. When she turned to greet him, her smile was radiant in a way that stopped him in his tracks. For a moment, he saw the woman he'd fallen in love with 2 years ago, vibrant and alive with an energy that had been absent from their home for months. "You look beautiful," he said, meaning it completely. "The dress is new." "Thank you. I picked it up during lunch today. I had a good day at the center. We got approval for the new reading program I've been developing." She talked about her work with animated gestures, describing the children she'd be helping and the innovative curriculum she'd designed. Minjun found himself genuinely engaged, asking questions and watching her face light up with each answer. This was the longest real conversation they'd had in weeks. But as the evening progressed, something nagged at the back of his mind. The confidence in her voice, the way she carried herself, the subtle changes in her style, it all suggested influences he couldn't identify. Zara had always been beautiful and intelligent, but there was a new self-assurance that seemed to come from somewhere outside their marriage. Over the following weeks, Minjun began to notice patterns that fed his growing unease. Zara was spending longer hours at the nonprofit, often arriving home energized rather than tired. She'd started wearing her hair differently, in natural curls that framed her face instead of the straight styles his mother had suggested were more professional. Her wardrobe had evolved too, incorporating colors and cuts that emphasized her personality rather than conforming to conservative Korean fashion expectations. Most troubling of all, she'd become protective of her phone. Previously, she'd left it casually around the penthouse, sometimes asking him to check messages when her hands were occupied. Now she kept it close, taking it with her to the bathroom and sleeping with it on her nightstand instead of the charging station in their closet. The shift in their physical relationship was subtle but unmistakable. Zara had always been responsive during their scheduled intimacy, but lately she seemed distracted, going through the motions without the engagement he'd grown accustomed to. When he held her afterward, she would lie still in his arms, but her mind felt miles away. Minjun's business pressure intensified during this same period. The merger with a Japanese electronics firm was facing unexpected complications, requiring 18-hour days and constant damage control. His father had made it clear that failure wasn't an option, that this deal would determine Minjun's readiness to eventually take over the company completely. The stress left him feeling raw and vulnerable in ways he hadn't experienced since childhood. Coming home to find Zara glowing with happiness that seemed disconnected from their marriage felt like a knife twisting in an open wound. He needed her support and comfort, but she seemed to have found whatever she needed somewhere else. The breaking point came 3 weeks after he'd first noticed the changes. Minjun had endured a humiliating meeting where his father had questioned his negotiation strategy in front of the entire board, suggesting that emotional distractions were affecting his judgment. The implication that his marriage problems were obvious enough to impact his professional reputation had been devastating. He'd come home that evening desperate for reassurance, hoping to find some way to reconnect with his wife. Instead, he'd found Zara laughing into her phone in their bedroom, her voice warm with affection as she spoke to someone who was clearly not a family member. "That sounds amazing. I wish I could have seen his face when you told him. You have such a gift for working with difficult people." Minjun had stood frozen in the doorway, listening to his wife use the tone of voice she'd once reserved for him with some unknown person who could make her laugh with genuine delight. When Zara noticed him watching, her expression had shifted to something resembling guilt. She'd quickly ended the call with a casual goodbye and turned to greet him with a smile that felt forced and hollow after what he'd just witnessed. "Who were you talking to?" he'd asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the jealousy burning in his chest. "Just someone from work. We were discussing the literacy event next month." Her explanation was reasonable, but something in her tone suggested there was more to the story. That night, as Zara slept beside him, Minjun had stared at the ceiling, wrestling with suspicions that felt both paranoid and completely justified. His surveillance began innocently enough. He started paying closer attention to her schedule, noting when she left for the nonprofit and when she returned. He began asking more specific questions about her work, probing for details that might reveal who was consuming so much of her energy and attention. Zara had always been honest with him, sometimes painfully so, but now he detected careful editing in her responses, strategic omissions that suggested she was protecting information she didn't want to share. When he asked about her colleagues, she spoke enthusiastically about the children and the administrative staff, but seemed to skip over certain details about the other professionals. The discovery that confirmed his worst fears came by accident. Zara had asked him to check her phone for directions while she was driving them to a dinner party. As he scrolled through her recent messages, he saw a name that appeared far more frequently than any work contact should: Marcus. The messages themselves were innocent enough on the surface. Discussions about fundraising strategies, scheduling conflicts, and shared articles about literacy education. But the tone was unmistakably intimate. Inside jokes, personal observations, and a level of emotional sharing that Minjun hadn't experienced with his wife in months. One message thread made his blood run cold. Marcus had sent Zara a photo of a jazz album with the caption, "This made me think of you." Her response had been a series of heart emojis followed by, "You always know exactly what I need to hear." The casual intimacy of their exchange felt like a betrayal more devastating than physical infidelity. This Marcus person understood his wife's tastes, anticipated her emotional needs, and received her genuine affection in return. Minjun realized he was looking at evidence of the connection he'd failed to maintain with Zara, now flourishing with another man. That night, he confronted her with the careful strategy he used in business negotiations. Instead of explosive accusations, he asked indirect questions designed to reveal the truth gradually. Who was Marcus exactly? How long had they been working together? Why hadn't she mentioned someone who was clearly such an important part of her daily life? Zara's responses became increasingly defensive as she realized what he was really asking. Marcus was the marketing director, a professional colleague who helped coordinate events. She mentioned him the same way she mentioned everyone else at work. There was nothing inappropriate about their relationship. But when Minjun pressed for more details, asking why Marcus seemed to know so much about her personal preferences and why they texted about non-work topics, Zara's composure cracked. "Are you seriously questioning my integrity right now?" she asked, her voice rising with indignation. "Are you accusing me of cheating because I have a friend at work who actually listens when I talk? I'm asking why you're sharing parts of yourself with him that you don't share with me," Minjun replied, his own control slipping. "I'm asking why you light up when you talk about work, but look bored when you're home with your husband." The fight that followed was their first real argument since the early days of marriage. Zara accused him of being controlling and paranoid. He accused her of emotional infidelity and betrayal. Both of them said things designed to wound. Years of suppressed frustration finally erupting into open conflict. The argument ended when Minjun grabbed her phone from her hands, demanding to read her complete message history with Marcus. The physical aggression shocked them both. Zara had never seen him lose control so completely, and Minjun had never allowed himself to act on jealous impulses so directly. Zara snatched her phone back, her eyes blazing with a fury that transformed her face into something he barely recognized. Don't you ever grab me or my belongings again. I don't care how suspicious or insecure you're feeling. Put your hands on me like that again, and I will leave this apartment immediately. Her threat carried a conviction that made Minjun step back, suddenly aware of how far he'd crossed the line. But instead of apologizing, his pride and fear combined into stubborn defensiveness. Maybe you should leave, he said coldly. Maybe you'd be happier with Marcus than with a husband who obviously can't give you whatever it is you're looking for. Zara stared at him for a long moment, and Minjun saw something die in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet and final. Maybe you're right. She'd slept in the guest room that night, and Minjun had lain awake knowing that their marriage had crossed into territory from which there might be no return. The morning after their explosive argument, Minjun woke to find Zara already dressed and preparing to leave for the nonprofit. Her movements were efficient and cold, avoiding eye contact as she gathered her materials for the day. When he tried to speak to her, she responded with monosyllabic answers that made it clear the conversation was over. You're not going to work today, he said as she reached for her car keys. We need to talk about what happened last night. Zara turned slowly, her expression incredulous. Excuse me, did you just tell me I'm not allowed to go to my volunteer job? I'm saying we have serious problems that need to be addressed before you run off to spend the day with Marcus. The way he spat Marcus's name made Zara's jaw tighten with anger. I have commitments and responsibilities to children who are counting on me. My marriage problems don't give you the right to control my schedule. Minjun stepped between her and the door, his business suit making him look formal and intimidating in their casual kitchen. This isn't about control. This is about respect. You're my wife, and I'm asking you to prioritize our relationship over whatever is happening with your colleague. I'm prioritizing the children I promised to help over your jealous paranoia, Zara replied, her voice steady despite the tension crackling between them. Now move away from the door. The standoff lasted several seconds. Minjun's desire to physically prevent her from leaving warring with his knowledge that such behavior would destroy whatever remained of their marriage. Finally, he stepped aside, but his parting words carried the weight of an ultimatum. If you choose to go there today, if you choose him over working on our marriage, there will be consequences. I won't tolerate being humiliated by my own wife's emotional affair. Zara paused in the doorway, her hand trembling slightly on the handle. What kind of consequences, Minjun? What exactly are you threatening? I have significant influence in Seoul's nonprofit community. Funding decisions, board appointments, strategic partnerships. The Literacy Center depends on corporate sponsors who value family stability and traditional values. The implication hung in the air like poison. Zara's face went white as she understood that he was threatening not just her position, but the entire program she'd worked months to develop. The children she'd committed to helping would suffer if he decided to leverage his business connections against her workplace. You would destroy a literacy program for underprivileged children because you're jealous of my friendship with a coworker, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I would protect my marriage from a man who's trying to steal my wife, Minjun replied, his tone suggesting he believed his logic was perfectly reasonable. Zara left without another word, but Minjun could see that his threat had landed exactly as intended. For the first time since their argument, she looked genuinely afraid of what he might do. That evening, Zara returned home subdued and withdrawn. She'd spent the day at the nonprofit, but her usual enthusiasm was absent, replaced by a careful neutrality that felt like armor. When Minjun asked about her day, she provided basic facts without any emotional content. We reviewed the budget projections. The spring fundraiser planning is on schedule. I updated the volunteer training materials. Her deliberate omission of any mention of Marcus was both a relief and a frustration. Minjun had achieved his goal of making her cautious, but the distance between them felt wider than ever. Over the following week, he implemented a campaign of subtle control designed to limit her independence without crossing into obviously abusive behavior. He began scheduling dinner plans and social obligations that coincided with her nonprofit hours, creating conflicts that forced her to choose between work and family harmony. He started monitoring her phone more carefully, checking her location services and noting when she deviated from expected patterns. He discovered that she'd been taking longer lunch breaks and occasionally leaving the nonprofit earlier than usual, behaviors that suggested she was finding ways to spend time with Marcus despite his warnings. The desperation driving his actions was something Minjun barely recognized in himself. He'd built his identity around control and strategic thinking, but jealousy was making him act like someone he didn't respect. The businessman who could navigate complex international negotiations was reduced to checking his wife's text messages and tracking her movements like a private investigator. His attempt to rebuild their physical intimacy was perhaps the most tragic miscalculation of all. 3 weeks after their fight, Minjun approached Zara in their bedroom with the focused intensity he'd once brought to their early relationship. He'd convinced himself that passionate sex would remind her of their connection and drive Marcus from her thoughts. But his touch felt desperate rather than loving, possessive rather than intimate. He kissed her with an urgency that had more to do with marking territory than expressing affection. When he whispered that he loved her, the words sounded like a claim being staked rather than emotion being shared. Zara responded physically because she always did, her body trained to accommodate his needs even when her heart was elsewhere. But Minjun could feel the difference. She was present but not engaged, available but not willing. Making love to her felt like winning a battle while losing the war. Afterward, as they lay in the darkness that had become their default state, Zara spoke the words that shattered his remaining illusions about their marriage. "I can't keep pretending this is working," she said quietly. "We're both miserable, and your jealousy is making everything worse. Maybe we should consider separation while we figure out what we actually want." The suggestion hit Minjun like physical violence. Everything he'd feared, everything he'd been desperately trying to prevent, was crystallizing into reality. His wife was actively planning to leave him for another man. "You want a separation so you can be with Marcus without the inconvenience of a husband," he said, his voice thick with pain and accusation. "I want space to figure out who I am when I'm not walking on eggshells around your insecurity," Zara replied. "I want to remember what it feels like to be valued for my thoughts instead of monitored for my loyalty." Her words were like daggers because they contained too much truth to deny. Minjun had been treating her like a flight risk rather than a partner, a possession rather than a person. But acknowledging that truth felt like admitting failure too devastating to face. The following day, his worst fears were confirmed when his private investigator provided photographic evidence of what had been happening during Zara's extended lunch breaks. The images showed her and Marcus in a small cafe near the nonprofit, sitting close together, her hand on his arm, both of them laughing with genuine joy. But the final photograph was the one that destroyed him completely. Marcus was holding both of Zara's hands across the table, leaning forward to speak directly into her ear. Her expression was soft and vulnerable in a way Minjun hadn't seen directed toward him in months. Whatever Marcus was saying was clearly significant, and Zara's response was a slow nod that looked like acceptance. That evening, Minjun confronted Zara with the photographs, his control finally shattering completely under the weight of undeniable evidence. "So this is what you call friendship," he said, throwing the images across their dining table. "This is what professional collaboration looks like." Zara stared at the photographs, her face cycling through shock, anger, and finally something that looked like relief. The secrecy was over. The pretense was finished. They could finally fight about what was really happening instead of dancing around implications and suspicions. "Marcus told me he loves me," she said simply. "He asked me to leave you and start over with someone who actually values what I have to offer." The admission was like a physical blow that left Minjun gasping for air. He'd known this moment was coming, but hearing it stated so plainly stripped away his last defenses. "And what did you tell him?" Minjun asked, though her expression had already provided the answer. "I told him I needed time to think." "But honestly, Minjun, what is there to think about? You've made it clear that you see me as a problem to be managed rather than a woman to be loved. Marcus sees me as someone worth fighting for." The fight that erupted was unlike anything in their marriage. Years of suppressed resentment poured out in accusations and counter-accusations that revealed the depth of their mutual disappointment. Minjun accused her of betrayal and emotional adultery. Zara accused him of control and emotional neglect. The argument ended when Zara announced that she was having dinner with Marcus that evening to give him her final answer. The defiance in her voice made it clear that Minjun's threats and ultimatums had lost their power over her. After she left, Minjun sat alone in their penthouse, surrounded by the expensive furniture and tasteful art that was supposed to represent their successful life together. Everything he'd worked to build was crumbling because he'd forgotten how to love his wife instead of controlling her. The decision to follow them to the restaurant was driven by desperation rather than strategy. Minjun needed to see the moment when his marriage officially ended. He needed to witness his wife choosing another man so that the fantasy of reconciliation could finally die. What he found when he arrived was worse than he'd imagined. Zara wasn't just having dinner with Marcus. She was glowing with happiness, animated and alive in ways that reminded Minjun of everything he'd fallen in love with and everything he'd somehow destroyed. Watching her laugh at Marcus's jokes, seeing her lean into his touch, witnessing the easy intimacy between them was like watching his future disappear in real time. When Marcus reached across the table to take her hand, and she didn't pull away, Minjun knew that his marriage was over. The sound of shattering wine glasses and startled gasps filled the upscale restaurant as Minjun's confrontation reached its explosive peak. Other diners had begun recording with their phones, and the manager was frantically calling security, but nothing could stop the 3-year avalanche of pain and desperation that was finally breaking free. "You want to know what this looks like?" Minjun shouted, his voice cracking with anguish as he gestured at the intimate table where his wife sat holding another man's hand. "This looks like my wife has already decided to destroy our marriage for someone who's known her for 6 months. Marcus stood protectively in front of Zara, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, you need to step back. You're causing a scene and frightening people." "I'm frightening people," Minjun laughed bitterly, tears starting to stream down his face in front of the crowded restaurant. "My wife is about to leave me for another man, and I'm the one who's inappropriate for having feelings about it." The breakdown that had been building for months finally erupted completely. Minjun's carefully maintained composure, the emotional control that his father had beaten into him through decades of conditioning, shattered like glass under the weight of losing everything that mattered. "You think I don't know what I've done wrong," he said, his voice breaking as he looked directly at Zara. "You think I don't realize that I've failed as a husband, that I've pushed you away with my jealousy and control and inability to give you what you need?" Zara's expression shifted from fear to shock as she witnessed her husband's complete emotional collapse. This wasn't the controlled, distant man she'd been married to. This was someone in raw, desperate pain, finally allowing himself to feel everything he'd been suppressing. "I know you're unhappy," Minjun continued, his words tumbling out between sobs that shook his entire body. "I know I've become someone you can't love anymore. I know Marcus treats you better than I do, listens to you better than I do, makes you laugh the way I used to before I became so terrified of losing you that I drove you away." The restaurant had fallen completely silent except for Minjun's anguished confessions. Even Marcus stepped back slightly, recognizing that he was witnessing something deeply private and painful that transcended simple jealousy. "But what you don't understand, what nobody understands, is that I love you so much it's killing me. Every day I watch you slip further away, and I have no idea how to stop it because nobody ever taught me how to love without controlling, how to be vulnerable without being weak, how to need someone without destroying them." His words hung in the air like a prayer, raw and honest in a way that cut through every defense Zara had built around her heart. For the first time in their marriage, she was seeing the man beneath the careful facade, the terrified boy who'd learned that emotions were dangerous and love was a luxury he couldn't afford. "My father taught me that showing feelings was the same as showing weakness," Minjun said, his voice barely audible now. "That men who couldn't control their emotions couldn't control anything else. That love made you vulnerable to people who would use it against you." He looked directly at Zara, his eyes red and swollen but completely focused on her face. "I was 8 years old when I found my father crying after a business failure. When he saw me watching, he made me promise never to let anyone see me break. He said broken men lose everything they care about." Zara felt something crack inside her chest as she finally understood the cage her husband had been living in. The emotional distance she'd interpreted as rejection was actually protection, his way of trying to preserve their marriage by following the only model he'd ever learned. "So I learned to hide everything," Minjun continued, his confession pouring out like blood from an open wound. I learned to provide instead of connect, to solve problems instead of sharing feelings, to control situations instead of trusting people. And when you started pulling away, when you stopped smiling at me and started finding happiness somewhere else, I panicked. Marcus had retreated to give them space, recognizing that this moment belonged to the marriage that was either dying or being reborn in front of the entire restaurant. His own feelings for Zara suddenly felt secondary to the devastating honesty unfolding before him. I hired investigators because I was terrified of losing you but too proud to ask what I'd done wrong, Minjun said, his hands shaking as he reached toward Zara without quite touching her. I threatened your job because I thought I could force you to choose me instead of learning how to be worth choosing. I tried to control your friendship with Marcus because I was too cowardly to compete with someone who actually knows how to make you happy. The admission of his surveillance and threats sent a ripple of horror through the watching crowd, but Zara barely noticed. She was transfixed by this glimpse of the man she'd married, the vulnerable soul he'd hidden so completely she'd forgotten it existed. You want to know the truth about Marcus? Zara said quietly, her own voice thick with emotion. He doesn't make me happy because he's a better man than you. He makes me happy because he treats me like my thoughts and feelings matter. Because he asks about my day and actually listens to the answer. Because he remembers things I tell him and brings them up later. Because he makes me feel like a person instead of a pretty accessory to your successful life. Her words were like knives, but Minjun absorbed them without flinching. This was what he'd needed to hear, the specific diagnosis of his failures that he'd been too afraid to request. I don't know how to be that man, he said simply. I don't know how to ask about your day without it feeling like interrogation. I don't know how to listen without trying to solve problems. I don't know how to share feelings I've spent 30 years learning to ignore. Then learn, Zara said, tears streaming down her face as she finally saw the husband she'd been grieving for months. If you love me as much as you say you do, then learn. Get help. Go to therapy. Figure out how to be vulnerable without seeing it as weakness. Figure out how to love me without trying to own me. Marcus cleared his throat softly, drawing their attention back to the triangle that had brought them to this moment of truth. I think I should leave, he said quietly. This conversation needs to happen between the two of you. Zara turned to look at him, this kind man who'd offered her everything she thought she wanted. Marcus had been her lifeline when she was drowning in loneliness, but seeing Minjun's complete breakdown had reminded her of something she'd forgotten. Her husband wasn't emotionally distant because he didn't love her. He was emotionally distant because he'd never learned how to love safely. I'm sorry, she said to Marcus, her voice gentle but firm. I'm so sorry for letting this go as far as it did. You're an amazing man who deserves someone who can love you completely. But I need to see if my marriage can be saved before I give up on it entirely. Marcus nodded with grace that spoke to his character. He'd fallen in love with a married woman, knowing the relationship was doomed from the start. Part of him had hoped her marriage was irreparable, but witnessing Minjun's complete vulnerability had shown him that their love was wounded, not dead. Take care of yourself, he said to Zara, then looked at Minjun with something approaching respect. Take care of her. She deserves better than what you've been giving her, but maybe you can learn to be the man who provides it. After Marcus left, Minjun and Zara sat alone at the table surrounded by broken glass and scattered rose petals, the wreckage of their public breakdown reflecting the state of their private relationship. The restaurant had mostly emptied, staff discreetly cleaning around them while giving them space to continue their conversation. I've made appointments with 3 different therapists, Minjun said quietly. Individual therapy and marriage counseling. I called them this morning before I came here, because I knew this conversation was coming and I wanted to have a plan instead of just promises. The admission surprised Zara. It suggested that his breakdown wasn't just dramatic performance, but the result of genuine self-reflection and commitment to change. I've also drafted a letter to the nonprofits board, officially endorsing continued funding for your literacy program regardless of what happens to our marriage. Your work shouldn't suffer because of my jealousy and control issues. These concrete actions, more than any emotional declaration, convinced Zara that Minjun was serious about transformation. He was offering accountability and systemic change, not just temporary remorse. I need you to understand something, Zara said, reaching across the table to take his hands for the first time in months. I didn't fall in love with Marcus because he's perfect. I developed feelings for him because he was giving me things that were missing in our marriage. If you can learn to provide emotional intimacy and genuine partnership, if you can learn to see me as an equal instead of a possession, then we might have a chance." Minjun gripped her hands like anchors, afraid that letting go would mean losing her forever. "I know I have to earn your trust back. I know saying I'll change isn't enough after everything I've put you through. But I'm asking for the chance to prove that the man you fell in love with is still here, just buried under years of fear and bad examples." Their conversation continued for hours, restaurant staff working around them as they finally had the honest discussion that should have happened months earlier. They talked about cultural expectations and family pressure, about emotional needs and communication failures, about the difference between love and possession. By the time they left the restaurant, nothing was resolved completely. Zara hadn't committed to staying in their marriage, and Minjun hadn't magically healed from decades of emotional conditioning. But they'd established a foundation for rebuilding, a shared understanding of what had gone wrong and what would need to change. The photographers and social media posts from their public breakdown would haunt them for weeks, their private pain becoming sole gossip and tabloid speculation. But for the first time in their marriage, they were facing the future as honest partners instead of polite strangers, and that felt like the beginning of something worth fighting for. 3 months after the restaurant confrontation that had shattered their marriage and rebuilt it simultaneously, Minjun sat in Dr. Sarachen's office for his weekly therapy session. The breakthrough that had taken 30 years to achieve was now being carefully maintained through consistent professional guidance and daily practice in emotional vulnerability. The work was harder than any business negotiation he'd ever conducted. Learning to identify his feelings before they exploded into jealous rage required constant vigilance. Learning to express needs without making demands meant rewriting decades of learned behavior. Learning to trust Zara's love without controlling her actions felt like walking a tightrope without safety nets. But the changes were becoming visible in ways that surprised him. Last week, when Zara had mentioned working late on a new project with several colleagues, his first impulse had been the familiar spike of suspicion and control. Instead of demanding details or making threats, he'd taken a breath and asked a simple question. "Would you like me to bring you dinner so you don't have to worry about eating while you work?" The smile that had lit up her face in response was worth more than any business victory he'd ever achieved. Dr. Chun had helped him understand that his father's emotional conditioning hadn't been malicious, just generationally damaged. Mr. Park had raised his son according to survival strategies that had worked in post-war Korea but were destructive in modern relationships. Learning to separate his father's pain from his own identity was ongoing work that required patience and self-compassion. Meanwhile, Zara was doing her own healing work with individual counseling and boundary setting that went far beyond their marriage. She'd finally confronted Mrs. Park about the cultural criticism and controlling behavior, establishing clear limits on interference in their household decisions. The conversation had been respectful but firm, with Zara explaining that she valued Korean traditions while maintaining her own cultural identity and personal autonomy. Mrs. Park's initial resistance had given way to grudging respect when she realized that her daughter-in-law's newfound confidence was making Minjun happier and more emotionally stable. Their marriage counseling sessions were intense and sometimes painful, but they provided structured space for the honest communication that had been missing for years. They learned to fight productively, addressing conflicts directly instead of letting resentment build until it exploded into destructive patterns. The physical intimacy between them was transforming as well. Minjun's desperate possessiveness had been replaced by genuine curiosity about Zara's pleasure and emotional needs. Their lovemaking became conversation rather than performance, connection rather than conquest. One evening in late spring, they lay together in their bed after making love with a tenderness and presence that would have been impossible months earlier. Minjun traced patterns on Zara's bare shoulder, marveling at how different touch could feel when it came from love rather than fear. "I need to tell you something," Zara said quietly, her fingers playing with the hair on his chest. "I've been offered a position heading the literacy program expansion to 3 additional centers across Seoul." Minjun's body tensed involuntarily, the old reflexes of control and suspicion firing briefly before he consciously relaxed and focused on what she was actually saying rather than what his fear was imagining. That's incredible. It means your program is being recognized as successful enough to scale citywide. How do you feel about the opportunity? The question was simple, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he approached her career achievements. Instead of immediately calculating how her success might affect their marriage, he was genuinely interested in her perspective and feelings. "I'm excited but nervous," Zara admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, and it means traveling to different neighborhoods to train new staff and set up curricula. I'd be away from home more, working longer hours during the setup phases." Before therapy, Minjun would have heard this as a threat to their relationship stability and responded with subtle discouragement or demands for reassurance. Now he recognized it as information about her professional growth that required support rather than management. "What kind of support would be most helpful for me during the transition period?" he asked, surprising himself with how naturally the question came. Zara turned in his arms to look at his face, checking to see if his supportive response was genuine or performed. What she saw was authentic interest in her success, tinged with pride rather than resentment. "Just trust that my success at work doesn't diminish my commitment to our marriage," she said. "Trust that when I'm passionate about helping children learn to read, it doesn't mean I'm less passionate about building a life with you." The conversation that followed was the kind of partnership planning that should have been happening since their wedding day. They discussed logistics and emotional needs, potential challenges, and mutual support strategies. Minjun offered concrete help with household responsibilities and expressed genuine enthusiasm for her professional recognition. But the real test of their transformation came 2 weeks later when Marcus sent Zara a congratulatory email about her promotion. The message was brief and professional, but it represented contact with the man who had nearly become the catalyst for their divorce. Minjun discovered the email by accident when Zara left her laptop open while taking a shower. The old version of himself would have read every word, analyzed every nuance, and confronted her with accusations and demands. Instead, he closed the laptop without reading beyond the subject line and mentioned it casually when she emerged. "Marcus emailed to congratulate you on the promotion. It was nice of him to reach out professionally." Zara paused in toweling her hair, studying his face for signs of the jealous rage that had previously consumed him at any mention of Marcus. What she found was calm acceptance and genuine disinterest in monitoring her professional correspondence. "He probably heard about it through nonprofit networking channels," she said simply. "I haven't had any contact with him since that night at the restaurant." Minjun nodded and moved to embrace her, his touch conveying trust rather than possession. The moment passed without drama or conflict, marking how far they'd traveled from the destructive patterns that had nearly ended their marriage. The pregnancy announcement came on a warm Saturday morning in June as they worked together in the small garden Zara had started on their penthouse terrace. Minjun was helping her transplant seedlings while she explained the symbolic significance of each plant in creating a fusion of Korean and American botanical traditions. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly as they knelt together among the flowers and herbs that represented their blended cultural identity. Minjun's hands stilled on the soil, his mind processing the magnitude of what she'd just shared. A year ago, the news would have triggered immediate pressure about family expectations and child-rearing responsibilities. Now his first thought was wonder at the life they'd created together during this period of healing and growth. "How do you feel about it?" he asked, echoing the question that had become his default response to her major announcements. "Hopeful," Zara replied, her hand moving to rest over her still flat stomach. "Scared but hopeful. This baby will grow up seeing parents who know how to communicate and fight fairly and love each other honestly." Minjun kissed her then, tasting soil and sunshine and the salt of happy tears on both their faces. The child growing inside her would be born into a marriage that had been tested and rebuilt, a family that valued emotional honesty over cultural performance. As summer progressed, their relationship continued to deepen and stabilize. Minjun's business responsibilities remained demanding, but he'd learned to compartmentalize stress instead of bringing it home to punish Zara with distance and control. Their evening conversations became genuine exchanges rather than polite reports, with both of them sharing victories and struggles from their respective days. The social media attention from their restaurant breakdown had gradually faded, replaced by Seoul society's fascination with other scandals and dramas. But the experience had taught them that their love was strong enough to survive public scrutiny and private pain. That commitment meant choosing each other even when the choice was difficult. On their third wedding anniversary, Minjun surprised Zara with a ceremony of recommitment that honored both their cultural backgrounds and their individual growth. Instead of the elaborate public performance their original wedding had been, this celebration was intimate and personal, attended by close friends who had witnessed their journey from breakdown to breakthrough. The vows they wrote themselves reflected the lessons they'd learned through months of therapy and honest communication. Minjun promised to love Zara with open hands rather than closed fists, to trust her autonomy while offering his support. Zara promised to communicate her needs directly rather than seeking fulfillment elsewhere, to fight for their marriage when conflict arose rather than retreating into protective silence. As autumn arrived and Zara's pregnancy became visible, they prepared for parenthood with the same intentional communication that had saved their marriage. They discussed parenting philosophies and cultural values, gender expectations, and emotional modeling. Their child would grow up seeing love expressed through respect and partnership rather than control and possession. I want to ask all of you something as we reach the end of Minjun and Zara's story. Whether you're watching this from your living room, your car during a lunch break, or anywhere else around the world, have you ever experienced the kind of jealousy that nearly destroyed their marriage? The desperate need to control someone you love because you're terrified of losing them. Can love really overcome the deep emotional barriers that trauma and conditioning create? Or are some patterns too ingrained to change? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments, because these are the questions that touch all of our hearts when we're brave enough to love completely. 6 months after their recommitment ceremony, Zara gave birth to a daughter whose arrival marked not just the expansion of their family, but the complete transformation of their marriage. As Minjun held his child for the first time, feeling her tiny fingers grip his thumb with unconscious trust, he understood that love wasn't about possession or control. Love was about creating space for another person to flourish while choosing them again and again, especially when that choice required growth and change and the courage to be vulnerable. It was about building something together that was stronger than individual fear, deeper than cultural expectation, and more enduring than the painful patterns of the past. Their marriage had died and been reborn in a restaurant filled with strangers and broken glass. But it had truly been healed in the quiet moments of daily choice, in therapy sessions and difficult conversations, in the decision to trust love over fear and partnership over possession.